Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, and welcome to Then and Now. I'm Zdencanovic, the host of this week's episode. In May 2025, President Donald Trump signed an executive order aimed at stripping federal funding from NPR and PBS. His administration has accused public broadcasting of promoting a liberal bias that is subsidized by taxpayer dollars. The move has sparked lawsuits, congressional fights, and a national debate about who public media is for and whether it should exist at all. Here to discuss the origins of NPR and PBS and how public broadcasting became a political target is Josh Shepperd. Josh is Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder and a Sound Fellow at the Library of Congress. He's the author of the prize-winning book, Shadow of the New Deal, The Victory of Public Broadcasting, published by University of Illinois Press in 2023. He is also the co-author with Allison Perlman of a forthcoming official history of PBS and NPR. Josh Shepperd, welcome to Then and Now.
Thank you for having me.
So President Trump has recently moved to strip funding from NPR and PBS. He's claiming they are biased, they've violated their public mission. So let's start by walking our listeners through the Trump administration's recent attacks on public broadcasting. How does this fit with the broader ideological and political project of the Trump administration?
Yeah, so, there's almost nothing about public media that is demanding for a closure or a cutting in funds. It's roughly $1.60 per person per year. It's incredibly cheap. It's really the cheapest of any public system for, like a popular audience or wide audience. It is largely based in local journalism, even though it has national branding. It's about 1,500 stations spread between television and radio. That includes affiliates that are not public but community media. And, the idea that you would need to cut a public service like this is completely an ideological one. The service itself, I would qualify as mostly centrist. I would not say it's very liberal at all. That's just some kind of like branding that they're giving to it, that it's like some kind of woke, as their word, project of some type. And really what's happening is that we're going through a pretty dramatic resettling of the government and public services, and the mere reporting on it is enough to dissuade specific interests from wanting it to broadcast the actual policies, events, and conduct the actual interviews that are associated with public media. And, in large part, NPR and PBS are based in education, Head Start programming, and just journalism media ethics, as they call it, which is to say just a standard for trying to be as fair with the reporting as possible, even when it doesn't succeed, which is sometimes often, with how they go about it. So there's actually very little popular sentiment to cut the funds. There's actually almost no support for it at all. And then if you ask certain constituencies, mostly on the right, and then, sometimes on the left, but very small amount, they will typically say, sure, we can cut it if Trump wants to, but it wouldn't have made their top 100 things that they were worried about. They just kind of go along. So yeah, it's kind of an ideological moment that is affecting the machinations of a public service that is only really about 50-something years old.
And tell us about the funding structure of NPR and PBS. Will these entities be able to survive without federal funding, or would they be able to make up the difference through donations and other funding sources?
Yeah, so the second question first, I think funding's up 7 to 8% from donations since this announcement, which will not be enough. Just for the record, it's still nice that people are trying to support it, I suppose. So what is the funding for public media? That's kind of like one of the topics of the book is where did it come from and why is it so idiosyncratically structured the way that it is, and what were the intellectual, political, and institutional and even aesthetic histories that led to that specific form, because it can actually be historicized very easily based upon the documents we have available. So, public media is one degree of separation from government, and that is why they call it a corporation. The corporation receives an earmark from Congress each year. It's gone up to about 550 million or so. It goes up and down a little bit, usually just slightly up. It's not well supported by either party. Democrats are largely tepid about it or would have done more, at least since the Great Society. Republicans don't like it because they don't believe in public services in general, including Medicaid, right? Even cancer research. So it's just kind of like grouped together with those things. And the 550 million is then um, allocated to stations largely not for content creation, which is the main social critique, but through what they call just simply block grants for operations. So a lot of the 550 million go to the member stations, not NPR and PBS. PBS is like infinitely low amount of money, for example, that it receives. And NPR is a little bit more, but it's still like under 10, 12%, I think, even for NPR for funding. And the stations essentially pay for transmitters, boards, gas for the car for the reporter. And so the idea is that if you have this federally funded corporation that is primarily tasked with supporting infrastructure, if you remove the money for the infrastructure, which accounts for, I think, total about 1/4 of all funding that goes into public media, it's not completely reliant upon it. There's no backup plan for how to address, the inequities that will appear, especially in rural towns and otherwise, for operations. So they're going to just try to cut off the programming to attack the content. And so that's kind of like the principle here. But in general, what the Corporation of Public Broadcasting is logistical support. I mean, that's the majority of what it does.
That's a good transition into the history. So, you've written a book on the history of public broadcasting. How did public broadcasting come to exist in the United States in the first place? What's the prehistory of NPR and PBS?
Yeah, so radio is an interesting topic because it's so central to cultural discourses, during these big political moments. And this was absolutely true during the New Deal, which is what the book is mostly about, and then slightly after the New Deal. And, public media has its origins in compulsory public education. So you got to go to school, right? These laws. These were always state-based laws that appear roughly in the 1860s and aren't even completed until 1918. There's not, you have to go to school in every state until roughly the moment in which what we call broadcasting, so a one-to-many model emerges, which is roughly 1920. It's just right after that. So the idea was, okay, if everyone needs to go to school and everyone should have the services provided by the state, what about like agrarian culture, right? What about new immigrants? And the notion was we have this new technology, new for the time. It's not film, right? Film's a little bit different of a history or cinema, which is my field. And then they thought, okay, if we could just get 20, 30 miles outside the university, then after like 12 days on the farm, someone wouldn't have to get on their horse and ride in at 5 p.m. for a class. It could be a correspondence class. So from there, the tying of early, what they call distance learning, uh, to equal access to education bureaucracy laws uh, sets the origins of the aesthetics of what becomes public media itself. And by that, I mean you get genres. So you get home economics, right? Because there's a big gendered divide over who could work and, and then what was the roles. So home education was one of the major topics at the time. You get history classes. You get a lot of American history of different types. Commercial broadcasting is also doing some history around this time. And you get like, what are the pork belly prices for the day? What's going to be the weather for the day? These kind of what we would call public service models that begin to emerge and associated. And all of these become the genres of public media later. So like home economics becomes cooking shows like Julia Child, right? You get like travel shows out of history shows, you get Anthony Bourdain even, or something like that out of these legacies that go on to cable television. So a lot of what public media has been historically, if you take a 100-year view, is an extension of state services through land-grant universities by which the programming was specifically educational and then translated over time to what we would now call like educational entertainment or something like that. And then that becomes further inscribed with different ideological commitments, like what they would have called cultural uplift at the time, which begs pretty obvious questions like whose culture and whose uplift, right? And in what ways and stuff. But that's where you get Shakespeare, right? And that's why they have like the Boston Pops on PBS, because these were considered high culture on what they at the time considered a low culture outlet, which would have been radio. That would have been too mass culture for a lot of groups, but they could still at least see the Shakespeare on television, right? Even if they couldn't go to the theater. So that's it. So that, the origins is education.
And you write about how this model of educational programming culminated in the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 under the Johnson administration during the Great Society. So this created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So tell us, what was this law intended to do, and what role did the Corporation for Public Broadcasting play in shaping the system that we know today?
Yeah, so I'll take one step back and forward on this, because a lot of the history that was written before I wrote the book was built around something called the Communications Act of 1934. That's the first major media legislation in the US. And the Communications Act of 34 inscribes the designation of frequencies. So to put differently, it decides who gets to buy a radio station, right, and then broadcast with it in terms of what they called public interest. And public interest was kind of a term they were batting around during Hooverism about commerce. And it essentially becomes the logic of how media becomes sold or becomes occupied. And it does so in a way that really supported commercial broadcasting interests. They already own the infrastructure. Public interest referred to the capacity to reach wide audiences. And you have these early groups like RCA, which owned NBC, who are Westinghouse and GE, but also AT&T with the wires. And then you get United Fruit. So why United Fruit? So they had the patents for boat communication, for wireless and stuff like that. So it's a veritable monopoly. And at the moment of exploration for this non-commercial model, this educational extension model, which is coming into competition due to what they called frequency scarcity at the time. There might only be 3 AM stations in a town, so how do you decide who gets them, right? They ended up going with just who could take care of themselves at that moment. And of course, the head start was held in capitalist groups. And so what happens is in 35, they strip almost all the educational licenses in the country. So we have this early experiment, like with home economics programming, that wasn't very good, frankly, at the time, because they hadn't really figured out how to use the medium yet. But the experiment is cut short, and equal access to education is cut short. And almost all the stations are given to commercial interests. And this galvanizes what we now call the media reform movement. And my colleagues, Robert McChesney, who just passed away, Victor Picard, Allison Perlman, I have a colleague, Laura Garbus, who has a book coming out on Princeton Press, like imminently on the radio side of this history. So there's been very good work on it, but no one had looked at what happened after the collapse of educational media by the new FCC, which was created by the Communications Act, regulating the new law that eliminated educational licenses. So this gets us to a point where there's a lot of advocacy, which the book looks at the logistics of, it looks at the aesthetic evolution of, and it looks at the lobbying history and also concepts of media and the philosophies of media. That brings us to when they finally begin to succeed. And that's kind of what the book is about, is it's like what strategies in media activism history have actually succeeded at changing federal policy. And then how does that work? And so that's we can get to that if you want in a minute. So when we get to the CPB, after this period of advocacy in which they improve educational content, but then also figure out how to lobby appropriately. The Carnegie Commission puts out right before the Public Broadcasting Act of 67 this argument that it's good for the Great Society, right? This is another kind of thing that they could support nationally. It's this educational infrastructure, national educational television and radio, and they could actually make it a federally funded service to mitigate Cold War tensions or fascism or these types of things. And a corporation is created essentially as an extension of a revisiting of the New Deal ideology that there should be this infrastructure that is national, not just state-based, for equal access to education. So the Corporation of Public Broadcasting is given three titles. And the first is the infrastructure stuff I talked about. The second is like content research, and the third is like researching audiences. So program development, but just a little bit, and then audience research, like who's listening, is it working, and all that kind of stuff. And that's it. So the Public Broadcasting Act is essentially the extension of just advocacy history, but also a few laws that came right before it. One is called the Educational Television Facilities Act, which was in 62. The Public Broadcasting Act is the renewal of that. That's the 5-year renewal. And then I think a lot of people will know the National Defensive Education Act of 58, which mandated that if there's going to be compulsory education, that there has to be equal access everywhere. And this is like the philosophy of public media, is like there's equal access to education, equal access to information, and that there needs to be technical infrastructure for it to be achieved. And that's it. That's the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, is to implement this kind of what I'd call pastiche of different interests and motivations that lead us to Big Bird.
And was public broadcasting politicized from the beginning? Was it always a source of partisan political debate?
Yeah. So, if you go back to like the 30s, and the book's mostly the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but with some gesture up to the Public Broadcasting Act, commercial broadcasting didn't want to make educational content, and they're largely given that responsibility after the act. And I would call, corporate media history something more like a libertarian media history, in which if it's profitable, if there's listenership, then it works. Victor Pickard has also written about this. I want to mention him one more time. And then, there's an ideological sort of implicitness that I would say skews conservative within the American system about media ownership. And so what happens is, when you get later into the passing of the Public Broadcasting Act, two things happen. One is that there's this notion that a private public sphere is, in fact, the better public sphere. And in film and media studies, there's actually, within a lot of research in my field, it's still kind of that sentiment exists in the research because they're so immersed in these industrial histories. And so there's some resistance to the idea, just on the basis that the American system has always been, sponsorship within the commercial model, or that specific, entrepreneurs should be able to make their way without the government getting in the way. So there's that part of it. The other side of it is kind of interesting, which is that the support for it also came, which Alison Perlman writes about, that certain parts of the country actually ended up supporting it that they didn't think would, like Alabama, because there was struggles against equal access to education and desegregation in these states. And they could make the argument that equal access to education could be achieved through technology, and that this would actually fix the problem so they didn't have to integrate schools and stuff like that. So these arguments kind of for it and against it. And then when you get to the early 70s, Nixon just doesn't like being covered by the news. So he goes up right after. And that's kind of the famous thing, is that Nixon tries to defund it multiple times and kind of gives up. He doesn't quite fail as much as give up on it. But for him, it was more, I think, vanity than ideological. And then there's these struggles that are famously covered by, like, about Mr. Rogers talking to the Senate. That was mostly showpiece theater, though. Mr. Rogers and the famous interlocutor, Senator Pastore, were actually like kind of pals, and Pastore was actually a Democrat who helped to write the bill and stuff. But he makes it seem like it's a tough questioning at the moment, and a lot of the audience will have noted that moment from the Tom Hanks movie or something.
Trump and his allies in Congress, such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, have accused NPR and PBS as being these liberal echo chambers, these bastions of liberal bias. So you mentioned a little bit earlier that that's not really true. That's not really empirically the case. But where do these perceptions come from of NPR and PBS as having this liberal slant? Is there a history behind these claims?
Yeah, let's talk more about that for sure. So the idea of equal access to education is anathema to a lot of right-wing interests, I think. Just the idea that we would have an equal access to trade information, or that everyone in a community would be covered by a feature, right? Which is one of like the aesthetic styles of NPR, for example. It's very feature-based news in which you learn about people. You don't just learn the news, right? That's like one of the things that they started as early as 1970, 71. So the notion that it's ideological, to my perspective, is largely just propaganda, because to me, NPR struggles too hard to both side or most issues, right? So if someone's like arguing that they have a right to mistreat a people's or like a community, NPR is probably going to provide the standpoint unproblematically of the person who claims that to the people who are being affected. To me, that's center right news reporting. I don't think that's actually liberal or left at all. But the fact that the perspectives are being covered seems to be the problem to the current political dynasties. So Bush, number two, tried to defund it, but kind of gave up quickly. Mitt Romney ran against Big Bird. I don't know if you remember that from the debates with Obama. He actually said he wants to defund Big Bird. He didn't even say PBS. So it's an old idea going back to Nixon that public funds shouldn't be used for like a kind of self-surveillance of government, because their model of government is quite different than the Great Society model. It's kind of that simple. So further, I would say ideologically, the attacks are further buttressed by the fact that it's very difficult still, even though there's so many more channels than there used to be, but to get a frequency. So a frequency, if it is going to be occupied by a new broadcaster, has to be purchased, and it has to go on the market. So there's usually a couple per year per town, but they've mobilized the FCC for the first time against public media. FCC is saying that NPR is falling out of compliance with its podcasting and these types of things. Compliance is, many of your listeners will know, just kind of like technical term for meeting criteria for renewal of a license. So what are all the technical specs and what are the requirements for daily broadcasts, top of the hour IDs, things like that we all know about. And so they're looking for reasons to see that public stations are falling out of compliance while public media is being attacked by Congress under the conditions that it's political, commitment of some type for Democrats or whatever they're saying at this moment. But the combination thereof means that they could sell frequencies that would be newly on the market to religious stations or right-wing broadcasters. So the plan isn't just to get rid of like what they see as a competitor who's going to sort of do some truth-telling of some type. It's also to monetize and privatize media so that they are dominating messaging. And so I think like that's some of the politics that's happening right now. And I think they're actually probably going to succeed a little bit. I don't think they can quite take out the big stations in the big cities. Those will probably survive. But a lot of like the communities that really need like a public radio, for example, like Panhandle, Nebraska. So I'm in Colorado now. I'm from Chicago, by the way. In Panhandle, Nebraska, like there might be one public media station covering Panhandle and no commercial stations covering local news. And then it just becomes national news, right? And it's just ideology at that point if they're just like sort of funneling in some kind of Sinclair broadcast that's all politics coming from DC or something like that. So these are all the things that are going on with, I think when they're talking about this, is they're actually very smart about how to go about it, and they actually have plans. It's not just random.
And lastly, Josh, how do you think a historical perspective can help us better understand this set of challenges that is facing public broadcasting today?
Yeah, so I think, I have a lot of answers to this actually. So I'll start with, public media is actually not very aware of its history, and it hasn't been good at defending itself historically. It's just kind of like people going to work. But it's public media is based in a principle of what technology means, which they would qualify less philosophically as an academic as equal access to education, right? That was the principle that the book looks at. Took 50 years of advocacy to realize as a policy. And there's all these like trials and errors along the way. Um, the fact that it's a mission statement based approach to broadcasting and not simply a sponsorship model in which you're trying to be entertaining and get money, which, by the way, has given us a lot of great history. I love the commercial model too in a lot of ways. And most of my viewing on television comes from HBO or something like that. I don't just watch PBS all day. But the idea that there'd be a fundamentally different vision for what technology means is crucial to understanding this history. And so I think that's like something that public media is beginning to rediscover, like at this moment, like this week, that kind of thing, that was important. I just like interviewed with Michigan Public Radio like a day or two ago about this, and they're actually asking this question of themselves. The second is that most research in my field, film and media studies, is focused on the successes of major studios and of what we would call media industries, which is the commercial model. But there's very little research on this abundance of primary sources that are available, millions of pages of the bureaucratic documents related to educational history around radio and television. But there's very little attention to these non-commercial systems, which I would qualify as fundamentally at least democratic aspirational. So I'd say film and media studies is a funny field because it's like super socially progressive, which is awesome. And then it's like super economically conservative, like they're almost economists, like in this way, in that like because something succeeded to make money within a commercial system, that it's like a good. It's a kind of a good in itself, right? There's not a lot of interrogation of that. So the book was an attempt at an intervention within film and media history to show that not only are there other systems that have competed or at least been present among commercial media history, but have in fact thrived and been tied to all these other social and cultural and political initiatives. So it's kind of like an attempt to show alternative histories to commercial logics alone, with me saying that I actually also appreciate those other commercial histories.
All right, let's leave it there. Josh Shepperd, thank you so much for joining Then and Now.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.